A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Members of the royal family, Prince William, Prince Andrew, Prince Edward, up to Balmoral. Charles was at that point there, along with his sister Princess Anne, who was already in Scotland. He didn't make it in time to see the Queen by the time she'd passed away.
For over a year, the world did not know. Queen Elizabeth II, the steadfast monarch who had ruled for 70 years,
Queen Elizabeth marks an extraordinary, historic 70 years on the throne.
Was hiding a secret that not even most of her government understood. Behind the palace walls, behind the carefully curated public appearances, she was battling a deadly illness. The public noticed she looked thinner, more fragile, more tired. But the truth was far more serious. By the summer of 2022, those closest to her knew. The Queen was dying. Yet, even as her body weakened, she carried out her duties with unwavering resolve, appointing a new Prime Minister just days before her final breath. What drove her to remain so resolute? Why did she choose to spend her last hours far from London, in the place she loved most? Today, we uncover the untold story of Queen Elizabeth II's final days, the secret she carried, and the courage that defined her until the very end. The decline. Nobody was supposed to see. The visible decline began with a death. In April 2021, Prince Philip passed away at the age of 99.
Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth, has died at the age of 99.
Ending a marriage that had lasted 73 years. Elizabeth and Philip had been together since she was a teenager. He had been at her side through everything: the unexpected ascension to the throne, the crises and scandals that rocked the monarchy, the births of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the slow transformation of Britain from imperial power to modern nation. He was the one person who could speak to her as an equal, who could tease her and challenge her and make her laugh when the weight of the crown became too heavy. And then he was gone. Those who saw Elizabeth privately after Philip's death noticed something had changed. The energy that had carried her through 7 decades of public service seemed to be fading. There was a sadness in her eyes that had not been there before. She carried on, of course, because that is what she had always done, but something vital had been taken from her. The photographs from Philip's funeral showed her sitting alone in the chapel, masked and isolated due to COVID restrictions, a solitary figure in black. It was an image that haunted the nation. In October 2021, Elizabeth was seen using a walking stick for public engagements for the first time.
This is the first time the Queen's used a walking stick at a major public event.
It was a small thing, easily dismissed as a concession to age. She was 95 years old, after all. But for those paying attention, it was the first visible crack in the facade. That same month, she spent a night in King Edward VII's hospital in London. The palace said it was for preliminary investigations. Scheduled visits to Northern Ireland and the COP26 climate summit were cancelled. A sprained back in November kept her from the National Service of Remembrance, the solemn ceremony where Britain honors its war dead. For a woman who had attended that service every year of her reign, the absence was jarring. Then, in February 2022, she contracted COVID-19. The palace described her symptoms as mild and cold-like, but Elizabeth herself later commented that the disease does leave one very tired and exhausted. Those who saw her privately noticed she had not fully recovered. The coughs lingered, the energy did not return. By spring, the palace was regularly citing mobility issues to explain her absences from events she would normally have attended without question. The excuses were piling up. Something was clearly wrong. But the palace was not telling the whole truth. What they did not say publicly was that she was reportedly battling a form of bone marrow cancer called myeloma. According to biographer Giles Brandreth, a close friend of the royal family, this would explain everything: the tiredness, the weight loss, the mobility problems that kept her from public view. Myeloma causes bone pain, particularly in the pelvis and lower back. It often affects the elderly, and there is currently no cure. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson later confirmed he had known for over a year
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has accepted the findings of a report into
that she had a form of bone cancer. Her private secretary had warned him that her doctors were concerned, that she could decline sharply at any moment. The secret was being kept from the public. But those at the very top of the British government knew the truth. The Queen was dying. The place she loved more than any other. In the summer of 2022, 70 years into her reign, Queen Elizabeth made a decision that would turn out to be one of her last. She chose to spend the season at Balmoral Castle, her Scottish estate.
The Queen has arrived at Balmoral Castle for the start of her traditional Scottish holiday.
Rather than remain closer to London and its world-class medical facilities. On the surface, this was not unusual. Elizabeth had spent every summer at Balmoral for her entire reign, a tradition stretching back 7 decades. This time was different. Her health was failing, her doctors were concerned. Staying 500 miles from the specialists who could have been at her immediate disposal was, by any rational measure, a risk. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she chose the place she loved most. Balmoral was not just a holiday home to Elizabeth. It was the place where she felt most like herself. The 50,000-acre estate in the Scottish Highlands had been in the royal family since 1852, when Prince Albert purchased it as a gift for Queen Victoria. Victoria fell deeply in love with the wild Scottish countryside, with its rolling, heather-lined hills and crisp Highland air, and Elizabeth inherited not just the property, but Victoria's profound connection to the land itself. Her granddaughter, Princess Eugenie, once described Balmoral as the place where the Queen was most happy. She spoke of it as somewhere you could breathe and run, where there were always walks and picnics and dogs. So many dogs. The informality of life there stood in stark contrast to the rigid protocols of Elizabeth's official existence. At Buckingham Palace, every moment was scheduled, every interaction choreographed, every word carefully considered for its potential impact. At Balmoral, she could simply be herself. At Balmoral, Elizabeth drove her own Land Rover around the estate.
This would have had from you for the royal family, and specifically for the Queen, was that we got video of her driving. Yeah, she was sat in the driving seat.
Often faster than her passengers were comfortable with. She once famously terrified the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia by insisting on driving him around the grounds herself, chatting away while he gripped his seat in a country where women were not even allowed to drive. She hosted informal barbecues where she and Prince Philip would do the cooking themselves, serving stunned prime ministers who had expected silver service and found themselves being handed sausages by the monarch. She went fishing for salmon in the River Dee. She stalked deer across the Highland moors, sometimes crawling on her stomach through the heather to get close to them. She took long walks through the pine forests, going for miles without seeing another person. It was the one place where she could shed the weight of the crown and simply exist as a woman who loved the outdoors, who loved animals, who loved the wild beauty of the Scottish Highlands. As she once said, "You can go out for miles and never see anybody." There are endless possibilities. Prince Philip had proposed to her at Balmoral in 1946 during one of their long walks across the estate. They spent part of their honeymoon at Birkhall, a lodge on the Balmoral grounds, in the winter of 1947. Writing to her mother during that stay, The young Princess Elizabeth described it as heaven up here. Now, in the summer of 2022, she returned one final time. King Charles would later say in a speech to the Scottish Parliament that his mother especially treasured the time spent at Balmoral. And it was there, in the most beloved of places, where she chose to spend her final days. She chose. That word matters. Even at 96, even with her health failing, even knowing she might die far from the medical resources that could have prolonged her life, Elizabeth was still making her own decisions about how she wanted to live and where she wanted to die. The last time the world saw her smile, just 3 months before her death, Elizabeth made what would be her final major public appearance. In June 2022, the nation celebrated her Platinum Jubilee.
What we're celebrating is that Platinum Jubilee. There have been preparations going on for many, many years.
Queen Elizabeth,
marking 70 years on the throne. It was an unprecedented milestone. No British monarch had ever reigned so long. The celebration stretched across 4 days, with parades, concerts, and events across the country. Millions lined the streets of London. Billions watched on television around the world. But Elizabeth's participation was painfully limited. Her health had deteriorated so significantly that she could only appear briefly. She watched the Trooping the Colour parade from the balcony of Buckingham Palace, but she had to withdraw from subsequent events to rest. The public was told she was experiencing discomfort. What they were not told was the extent of her illness, the constant pain she was allegedly enduring, the sheer effort required for her to appear at all. According to biographer Robert Jobson, despite doctors advising her to conserve her strength, Elizabeth was determined not to disappoint her people. She pushed through the pain because she understood what the moment meant. 70 years of service, 70 years of showing up, of being present, of representing something larger than herself. She was not going to let her final jubilee pass without acknowledging the people who had supported her through it all. At the finale of the Jubilee celebrations, she made one last appearance on the famous Buckingham Palace balcony. Charles had reportedly persuaded her to appear for the sake of history. It took real courage, given that she was allegedly in constant pain from her illness. But there she was, dressed in green, smiling and waving at the crowds who had turned out to honor her reign. It would be the last time the public saw her on that balcony, the spot indelibly associated with the British royal family, where generations of monarchs had waved to their subjects on occasions of triumph and celebration. By the time she traveled north to Balmoral for the summer, those who knew her well understood that her time was running short. Yet she refused to simply retreat and wait for the end. She had one more duty to perform, one more act of service to complete. 2 days before her death, she would stand once again and do what she had done for 7 decades. She would be the Queen. The final duty. On September 6, 2022, just 2 days before her death, Queen Elizabeth performed her final constitutional duty. Normally, when a new Prime Minister takes office, they travel to Buckingham Palace to be formally appointed by the monarch. It is a ritual stretching back centuries, the symbolic moment when the power of government is conferred by the crown. The monarch does not choose the Prime Minister, but they formally invite them to form a government. It is one of the few remaining constitutional duties that only the sovereign can perform. But Elizabeth was at Balmoral, and she was too frail to make the journey south. So, for the first time in her 70-year reign, the ceremony was moved to Scotland. Liz Truss, the newly elected Conservative Party leader, flew north to Balmoral.
Liz Truss is elected as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party.
Boris Johnson came separately to formally resign his position. and Elizabeth, despite everything her body was going through, stood to receive them both. The photographs from that day tell a story the palace could not entirely control. Elizabeth had lost significant weight. Her face was thinner than it had been just months before. There was a dark bruise visible on the back of her right hand, which some later speculated was from an IV cannula, the kind used to deliver medication or fluids. Her eyes seemed to have difficulty focusing, but she was standing. She was smiling. There was still, observers noted, that familiar mischievous twinkle in her eye. 70 years on the throne, and she was still showing up, still doing her job, still being exactly who she had always been. What the public did not know was that her private secretary, Edward Young, quietly informed Liz Truss after the meeting that the Queen might not live much longer. He told Boris Johnson the same thing before his final audience, that she had gone down quite a bit over the summer. Johnson would later write that even then, he believed there was still time. He was wrong. The next day, September 7th, Elizabeth was scheduled to attend a virtual Privy Council meeting to swear in new ministers in Truss's government. At 6 in the evening, just as the meeting was supposed to begin, word came that it was cancelled. The Queen had been advised by her doctors to rest. It was the first real public sign that something was seriously wrong. The meeting had been cancelled at the very moment it was meant to begin. Those who understood royal protocol knew this was highly unusual. The carefully managed facade was beginning to crack. Foidrasse against time. By the following morning, the situation had become critical. The morning of September 8, 2022, began with alarm bells ringing through the royal family. By 7 in the morning, the Queen's condition had deteriorated sharply. Whatever stability had remained the day before had collapsed overnight. Her personal helicopter was dispatched to bring Prince Charles from Dumfries House, about 90 miles away. He arrived at Balmoral shortly before 10:30, rushing to his mother's bedside. Princess Anne was already there. She had been staying with her mother at the estate and had been at her side throughout the crisis. Camilla, then Duchess of Cornwall, was driven over from nearby Birkhall, the residence she and Charles used on the Balmoral estate. The inner circle was gathering. The end was approaching. At 12:32 in the afternoon, Buckingham Palace released an unusual statement. The carefully chosen words said the Queen's doctors were concerned for Her Majesty's health and had recommended she remain under medical supervision. The Queen, they said, remained comfortable at Balmoral. For anyone who understood the careful language of royal communications, this was deeply significant. The palace almost never commented on the Queen's health in this way. The word concerned, coming from royal doctors, was not used lightly. The statement sent shockwaves through the country. 28 minutes later, another announcement. Prince William, Prince Andrew, Prince Edward, and his wife Sophie were all on their way to Scotland. A plane carrying them left RAF Northolt and landed at Aberdeen Airport just before 4 in the afternoon. The journey from the airport to Balmoral took about an hour. They arrived at the estate shortly after 5. But by then, it was already too late. Prince Harry, who was in the UK for a charity event, was also making his way north. He had been informed of the situation by his father and had cancelled his planned appearance at the Well Child Awards. He traveled separately from the other family members, flying alone, while the rest of the family had traveled together. The journey took hours. Time was running out faster than anyone had anticipated. And for Harry, time would run out completely. Queen Elizabeth II died at 3:10 in the afternoon on September 8, 2022.
The royal family saying the Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon.
She was 96 years old. She had reigned for 70 years and 214 days, longer than any other British monarch in history. And in the end, only 2 of her children were confirmed to be with her at the moment of death. The daughter who was there. At the end, Charles, her eldest son and heir, had been at her bedside that morning, spending precious final hours with his mother. But according to reports, he and Camilla had stepped out briefly in the early afternoon. Perhaps they needed air. Perhaps they needed a moment to process what was happening. Perhaps they simply did not expect the end to come so quickly. Whatever the reason, when Elizabeth took her final breath, Charles was not in the room. It was Anne, the daughter who had perhaps always been closest to Elizabeth in temperament, who was by her side when she died. Anne had stayed, Anne had not left, and Anne was the one who held her mother's hand at the very end. There is something fitting about that. Anne had always been the most like her mother, stoic, devoted to duty. Uncomfortable with emotional display, happiest in the countryside with horses and dogs. Of all Elizabeth's children, Anne was the one who seemed to understand her best. Charles learned of his mother's death by phone. He was on his way back to the castle when it happened. The news came as he was walking through the Balmoral grounds. In an instant, he was no longer the Prince of Wales. He was King Charles III. The crown had passed, as it always does, in the moment of death. There is no interregnum in the British monarchy. The king is dead. Long live the king. Charles reportedly stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. Then he continued walking toward the castle to be with his mother's body. William, Andrew, Edward, and Sophie arrived at the castle about 2 hours after Elizabeth had already passed. They had raced 500 miles against time, and they had lost. The plane, the drive, the desperate hope that they would make it, all of it had been in vain. Harry arrived even later that evening, after the public announcement had already been made. He had been traveling alone, had left later than the others, and had the furthest to come emotionally as well as physically. The estrangement from his family had created distances that could not be closed by a last-minute flight. The death was publicly announced at 6:30 in the evening, more than 3 hours after it occurred. The delay allowed time for family members to be personally notified, for government officials to be informed, and for the formal protocols to be set in motion. The BBC interrupted its regular programming. Newsreaders in black suits appeared on screen, their faces somber. Crowds began gathering outside Buckingham Palace in London, where a rainbow had appeared in the sky earlier that afternoon. Some saw it as a sign. Flags across the country were lowered to half-staff. The United Kingdom, and much of the world, went into mourning. Her death certificate, released weeks later, listed the cause simply as old age. No mention was made of cancer or any other specific condition. The palace declined to comment on claims about her health that emerged in subsequent biographies. Even in death, Elizabeth's privacy was protected. The secret she had kept for over a year would remain officially unconfirmed. Queen Elizabeth II's story does not end with her passing. In many ways, it is only just beginning. Her final days revealed a woman who mastered the art of control, not over nations, but over her own fate. She chose where she would die, how she would be remembered, and which secrets she would take with her. Even in death, she protected the institution she had served for 7 decades, showing the world that power can be quiet, steadfast, and profoundly personal. But what does it mean for the monarchy now? How will the legacy of a queen who commanded loyalty without spectacle shape the future of the crown? And what other secrets lie hidden behind the gilded walls of palaces, waiting for history to reveal them? The answers are not simple, and the story is far from over. One thing is certain. Elizabeth's final secret has changed how we understand her, and the world will be watching what comes next.